Hello, everybody. You are listening to Through Time and Glades. My name is Albert.
And I'm Joan.
Alrighty, so today we have a new news episode. It is, the first week of November, so we're here with another monthly news episode. Um, but before we jump in, how have you been doing?
I've been doing great. Having finished the Dawn of Everything,
Mm.
I've been compiling my notes and going back through the book, and I'll slowly be working on my review slash impressions of the book for this series in due time. I
Ooh.
don't have anything specific as far as when I will do that. But I'll certainly keep you all posted. My mind has just been a buzz with everything, and going back to my other books and writing down notes from them. Just it's been a good time. It's been a really good time. I watched the new Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong,
Ooh,
so that was kind of fun on a Rarosaurus,
that's
which
right.
was one I was not expecting. I guess I hadn't been keeping up with the because I guess like they kind of mentioned which dinosaur they're going to do next way ahead of
Yeah.
time. I guess that flew off my radar. But I mean, oh my gosh, that was a really fun one.
Mm.
They just keep getting better and better with their um I mean their filming, their use of references and reference photos,
Mm.
and the animations are great.
Oh, yeah, they
I
always are.
loved the sequence at the beginning, the Blue's Clues parody, which
Mm.
I grew up with that, so that's that was just a treat. Um, but otherwise, I've been doing all right. I've been watching with my mom a bunch of old anthropology shows
Oh,
that
cool.
thankfully they've all been uploaded to YouTube, which has been fun.
Nice.
One is Millennium Tribal Wisdom and the Modern World, which came out in 1992. Um, I had the book version for a long time, and I only later found the series that was uploaded on YouTube. Admittedly, out of order, so I
Mm.
have to kind of go online and get the right order and find the videos through there.
Right.
Um, that's a really interesting one. It's David Mabry Lewis, who passed away about a decade ago or
Mm.
so, and he just kind of compares different themes that are common to people today that they think about often, life, death, love, um, those sorts of things, and how people in sort of industrialized Western societies handle those topics, and how people in more traditional indigenous societies handle those topics. And sometimes there's overlap, and oftentimes there's not. And it's definitely a very interesting look into cultural relativism, if you will.
Mm.
And the other one, and this was kind of a nice surprise because I was curious if it was available, because it's one of those series I had read about but had never seen before. This is David Attenborough's The Tribal Eye,
Oh,
which
huh.
came out in 1975.
Oh,
So he
wow.
was he was 49 years old, and he sure looks it. If you're used to his more recent shows, how
Mm.
much he's aged.
Right.
Um, and that one's a little bit more of a simpler premise. He goes to different societies and he looks at um, the aesthetic or ritual images that they make, and he kind of explains what their use is, and you know, is it art? Is it not art? How do we go about answering those questions? How do the people in those societies view these creations that they make
Mm.
out of wood and stone and grass? I mean, beautiful stuff. Talked about the Dogon in the West Africa and Pacific Northwest societies. He kind of goes all over the place. It's very old school Attenborough, which is always fun. So, if you've seen Life on Earth or The Living Planet, you'll kind of know what you're getting into.
Mm. Mm.
Um, and so, yeah, I've been watching those, and I've been really enjoying them. And I think I'll definitely be sure that we put links in the description in case you want to check those
Mm.
out too.
Mm.
Um, but that's kind of what's up in my world. What about you?
Oh, yeah. So let me think. I've been just super busy this week. So with a couple of things. So first of all, I'm still applying to different postdoctoral researcher and research fellowship positions because my PhD is gonna finish within the next 6 months or so, uh, and so I need to try and find a new position if I want to continue doing scientific research for a living. Um, so we'll see how that goes. The job market is pretty competitive, and you know, in many cases, the chances of getting any one individual position is pretty low. But I'll just try to apply to as many as I'm eligible for and see what sticks. Um, so that's one thing I've been doing. But what's been actually taking up more of my time has been going through and reading a manuscript, so basically a paper that's in the works that I am a co-author on. Now, it's mostly work being done by my lab mate. So he's the first author on that paper, but since I'm a co-author and contributed a little bit to it, I need to read through this draft and then make any suggestions or changes I think would be useful or helpful. And so I was doing that for most of the week. It's a very long and hefty paper. It's something like 140 pages long without the references. Um, so it took a while to go through it. But it's really coming together. My lab mate has been working for years on this paper, and so it's really exciting to see basically this. It's an essentially complete version of it now, and pretty much as soon as my lab mate goes ahead and makes the changes that I suggested and some of the other co-authors suggested, we're probably going to go and submit it to a scientific journal, and so it should get published if all goes well in the not too distant future, and I'll be sure to remember to mention on the show when it eventually does. Um, so yeah, that definitely took up a lot of my time this week. And the other main thing that took up my time this week was the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology conference. So this is a conference that happens every year. It's pretty much the biggest regular conference for vertebrate paleontologists who study backboned animals, and I've been to every one of them since 2016, I think. 2015. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Man, it's been long enough that I'm starting to forget the dates. But as one might expect, this year it took place online, just like it did last year because of pandemic reasons. Um, and so they did a few adjustments this year to taking into account feedback that people left last year. So, for example, this year they're keeping the online platform open for several weeks. So we still have like a couple weeks left to watch all the talks and look at all the posters that we want to, and get into contact with the authors if we want to, ask them questions or anything like that. Whereas last year they pretty much only kept it open for a week, like it would be at a physical conference, and which is pretty problematic because people didn't really get time off then to look at all the talks. But they only had 1 week to look at the talks. Yeah. It was kind of a mad scramble for everyone to attend that conference. But this year they decided to keep it open for longer, so that's nice. However, they also arranged some live events to kind of emulate the feeling of a physical conference. So they had like these designated times where there would be sessions. We would all get on Zoom, and then there might be a session. For example, this is the Q&A session for all the talks about birds, for example, all about bird paleontology, and then they would have a designated time, and those of us who presented in that session would have to log in and receive and answer questions from other people attending, and so on. And so there are all these sessions that were happening throughout the week, and because all the live sessions were scheduled to happen during this week, similar to like a physical conference. Even though they gave us more time to watch the talks, there was still a little bit of a time crunch to just kind of get to the talks that you were most interested in. Because if you want to attend the live sessions to ask the presenters questions, like quote unquote in person or at least face to face, then you would have to watch the talks beforehand, and so you would still have to try and watch all those talks within this week. So yeah, that kind of took up a fair amount of time as well. But SVP is always fun. There's always really cool and interesting new research being presented there. It does feel pretty different when it's virtual versus a physical conference. So fingers crossed, next year it'll be physical again, and we can do the usual SVP things. But even so, I think having this online SVP is better than no SVP. And I did actually get some interesting feedback and questions on my talk, so that's nice. Um, yeah, so I think those are the main things that I've been busy with this week. I guess before we get started, I'll mention that there's actually a pretty nice milestone that we passed for our channel through Time and Clades. And that is recently we have passed 500 subscribers. Wow.
Woohoo!
Yeah, that wow. I did not expect that. I did not expect the numbers to just jump up like that over the course of a week. That's really wonderful, and we really appreciate everybody's subscriptions and views so much, and all your wonderful comments as well. Yeah, I just hope we can continue to make content that appeals to all of you who are watching this channel.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, I mean, I've just been also tickled by the news as well, and that, especially on Twitter, the response has been pretty exciting too. So I put the announcement up,
Right.
and we just got a whole flood of likes and retweets, and it's like, oh my gosh, you guys!
Yeah, in fact, special shout out to Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong who retweeted it. I mean, yeah, that's wonderful. It's really the highest honor. I've said before on this show that I think Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong is probably my favorite educational YouTube channel at the moment, and so yeah, to get support from you guys, that's just amazing. Now, I do have to apologize that because I've been so busy this week, I actually haven't seen the new Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong episode yet. But I will. Like the first moment I have a spare hour, I will watch it because again, it's a wonderful channel, and I try to catch everything they produce. So yeah. Alrighty. Do you have anything else to add, or should we continue on to the news?
Yeah, no, we can move on. I
Alrighty.
believe I do my first story.
Looks like you're right. So yeah, feel free to jump into it.
All right, yeah. So this first story here, takes us all the way to the tip of South America, east of Tierra del Fuego, to the lonely Falkland Islands, and should really rightly begin on March 1st, 1833, when Charles Darwin, famous naturalist, first set foot on the islands during his famed voyage of the Beagle.
Hmm.
Now, thankfully, in a true Darwin fashion, he kept very good notes about the things he saw there, and gave a brief overview of the island's history under the European thumb, if I may read a sample. This archipelago is situated in nearly the same latitude with the mouth of the Strait of Magellan. It covers a space of 120 by 60 geographical miles and is little more than half the size of Ireland. After the possession of these miserable islands had been contested by France, Spain, and England, they were left uninhabited. The government of Buenos Aires then sold them to a private individual, but likewise used them, as old Spain had done before, for a penal settlement. England claimed her right and seized them. The Englishman who was left in charge of the flag was consequently murdered. A British officer was next sent, unsupported by any power, and when we arrived, we found him in charge of a population of which rather more than half were runaway rebels and murderers. The theater is worthy of the scenes acted on it. An undulating land, with a desolate and wretched aspect, is everywhere covered by a peaty soil and wiry grass, of one monotonous brown color. Here and there a peak or ridge of gray quartz rock breaks through the smooth surface. Everyone has heard of the climate of these regions. It may be compared to that which is experienced at the height of between 1 and 2,000 feet on the mountains of North Wales, having, however, less sunshine and less frost, but more wind and rain. So, yeah, woohoo. Um, Now, when Darwin explored the island, he came across some very unusual animals. A fox like species that we know today as the Falkland Islands wolf or probably more commonly the wera, whose closest living relative, surprisingly, is the equally unusual maned wolf of the South American pampas.
Mm.
Um, it was the only native terrestrial mammal on these islands. And so Darwin writes, and we shall continue. These wolves are well known from Byron's account of their tameness and curiosity, which the sailors who ran into the water to avoid them mistook for fierceness. To this day, their manners remain the same. They have been observed to enter a tent and actually pull some meat from beneath the head of a sleeping seaman.
Mm.
The gauchos have also frequently in the evening killed them by holding out a piece of meat in one hand and in the other a knife, ready
Mm.
to stick them.
Right.
As far as I am aware, there is no other instance in any part of the world of so small a mass of broken land, distant from a continent, possessing so large an aboriginal quadruped peculiar to itself. Their numbers have rapidly decreased, and they are already banished from that half of the island which lies to the eastward of the neck of land between St. Salvador Bay and Berkeley Sound. Within a very few years after these islands shall have become regularly settled, in all probability this or will be classed with the dodo as an animal which has perished from the face of the earth.
Oof.
And his prediction was unfortunately proven right,
Mm-hmm.
and the wera was extinct just 43 years after he had written those words. Having indeed been overhunted. And in fact, you can see a stuffed individual here on the bottom left of the screen.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the case of the Falkland Islands and their dogs have always been curious and mysterious. When Darwin landed there, indeed, when any Europeans landed there, there was not a single indigenous person on the island, nor any significant presence of them beyond some anecdotes about canoes being found in driftwood, which Darwin mainly thought was due to the current actually bringing him there from the mainland of South America.
Mm.
Canids can be good swimmers, but for one so small to span 480 kilometers by leg power,
Right.
that's not likely.
Mm-hmm.
So, how did those dogs get there? Well, there was one previous study from 2013 by Jeremy J. Austin and colleagues, and Albert, I thank you for bringing this to my attention. They took to genetic sequencing to figure it out. So they found that after separating from the main wolf lineage about 6.7 million years ago, the genus Deucyon, which is what the Falkland Islands wolf belongs to, became isolated in Argentina by about 16,000 years ago, where it then split into two species, Deucyon avis, which remained on the mainland, which is now also extinct,
Mm.
and Deucyon australis, which is the wera, which would then go on to colonize the Falkland Islands. The authors propose that given the depth of the Argentine coastal shelf, the animals could very easily have crossed over a frozen marine strait and thus walked to the island themselves, as they were living during the last glacial maximum when there was a lot of exposed land and certainly a lot of ice. Now, it has been previously proposed, at least by the 1970s, that somehow maybe people introduced the wera to the Falkland Islands as a sort of domestic or at least tamed companion. But in the absence of actual archaeological evidence, not to mention the mismatch of dates, if you have these dogs colonizing the islands by about 16,000 years ago, and yet you have people only inhabiting the South American cone by 14,500 years ago. So after that, this idea was more or less ruled out.
Mm.
Now, that didn't mean that the author's own hypothesis was safe either. There was admittedly no evidence for an ice bridge in this part of the world. And then, of course, there was the question, if the wera made such a crossing, why didn't other Argentine land mammals
Mm.
do so as well? And so this brings us to now, with the current study that we're going to talk about here by Kit M. Hamley and colleagues. They had paid attention to numerous lines of recent evidence, or at least relatively recent evidence, that seemed to suggest that other land mammals did make it to the Falkland Islands. and more specifically, humans. During the late 1990s, fossilized charcoal had been observed in rock layers dated to over 4,800 years ago on East Falkland that were purported to have come from human caused fires. And then there were two finds of stone projectile points. One that was found in 1976 on New Island, and I show that here on the bottom right of the images, and one from 1998 that was found in the northwest of the islands. Now, while proper dating doesn't seem to be possible on those tools at the moment, the latter was found to have been definitively crafted from localized quartzite that was found on the Falklands themselves. And their overall shape does match closely with stone tools produced by the Yaghan, or Yamana people, as the natives of Tierra del Fuego call themselves. These are the Fuegians that Charles Darwin met and came to know very well as three individuals who shared space on the Beagle with him. They were named Fuegia Basket, Jemmy Button, and York Minster by the crew of Robert Fitzroy. Now, if the autobiography, or at least the story of Darwin on the Beagle, then this should all be familiar to you. But if not, basically Fitzroy had previously taken those three individuals, plus another one who unfortunately died of smallpox on the way to the UK. And this was on an earlier trip. They were held hostage in Tierra del Fuego, in the hopes, well, at least in Fitzroy's hopes, that they could be westernized and Christianized, and then return to Tierra del Fuego to help with missionarying and future European contact and whatnot.
Right.
Well, that scheme did not work ultimately, but their stories nonetheless have made them the poster children, if you like, for the Yamana people. Now, all this being said, while there were discussions about a pre-European presence by Amerindians on the Falkland Islands, there was never any proper archaeological work done that could definitively say that this happened at all. So Hamley and colleagues thus took it upon themselves to set up a ground surface survey of New Island, where the 1976 stone point was found, the one pictured here, to see if they could find evidence themselves. Well, first, they found 7 deposits of marine bird and mammal bones that were disarticulated. Specifically, these represent the South American sea lion and the southern rockhopper penguin, which is that penguin with the funny yellow eyebrows.
Yep.
And those are animals that don't mix, for their bones to be found together like that, because the sea lions eat penguins.
Yeah.
Now, the locations of the bones on actively eroded surfaces also point, to the observation that these animals probably did not die in those exact spaces. More likely, it seems, these were brought over and processed by humans, which would then make them middens in the archaeological literature. And even though they didn't find cut marks on the bones, which is always nice to have, we do know from ethnographic records that the Yamana use mussel shells as knives, and these just don't leave cut marks on bones when they're used. Incidentally, the Yamana could have only captured these animals using bone harpoons, as well as slings, clubs, and the bow and arrow. In fact, the sea lions represent their most important source of meat, while their hides were taken for clothing and for use as tents. And so, secondly, they found that these recovered middens on New Island were dated to between 1275 and 1420 AD. So then, the team examined the charcoal records, specifically for 3 sites, including New Island and East Falkland, where they had been reported, as well as Bleecker Island. And what's really ingenious about this study is that the authors recognized the almost inhospitable nature of Mount Osborne on East Falkland, for human settlement. And so they determined that the charcoal samples that were found there were actually from natural fires, which is a thing that does happen there on occasion, when these natural wildfires. And so now they had a control sample to test the other charcoal records. So unlike the uniformity of the fires on Mount Osborne that happened with regularity, the New Island and Bleecker Island fires show a very clear sporadic sequence that is typical of what you find at sites with human-made fires. For example, one had spiked around 150 AD, and then there was another that spiked between 400 and 1550 AD. And then, of course, there are later records than this that match the time when Europeans started, hanging out in the
Mm-hmm.
Falklands. And of course, the ethnographic records also sit well with these observations. The Yamana were known to keep constant fires for warmth, so much so that the name Tierra del Fuego, which means the land of fire, was probably inspired by
Mm.
those records by early anthropologists and explorers. And so, lastly, the team returned to the question of the Wera and whether the evidence for an isolated non-human arrival to the Falkland Islands was strong, or if there actually was evidence that people brought them here after all. So the team looked at Wera bones that were found on West Falkland, and they performed stable carbon and nitrogen isotope analyses on them, to see what their diets were like in life, at least before they died. And so then they could compare these to other organisms as well as to peoples from Tierra del Fuego, pre and post contact. And what they found was that the Wera isotopes matched those of pre contact peoples like the Yamana, in the fact that they were feasting on the meat of sea lions and penguins. The authors state, and this is important, while these results may be consistent with selective coastal scavenging, they could also indicate a commensal relationship with humans.
Mm.
And so, turning again to the ethnographic records, we know that the Yamana were very familiar with dogs, and they brought them everywhere they went, in their boats or on land. And their neighbors in the inland regions, the Ona, or as they call themselves, the Selknam people, they had a domesticated variety of the Kulpio fox that they called the Fuegian dog,
Mm-hmm.
which is also unfortunately now extinct. Now, curiously, these Fuegian dogs seem to have undergone self-domestication through human interactions, just like the gray wolf did tens of thousands of years ago in Eurasia to give us our domestic dog breeds, Canis lupus familiaris. So it remains possible, then, that the Wera could very well have played a similar role to the Yamana. You know, there is a gravesite in Tierra del Fuego called Loma de los Muertos, in which a member of that mainland species, Dusicyon avis, was actually purposely buried some 1550 years ago.
Mm.
So maybe the Wera was a domesticated form of this species, which was then brought to the islands, where that could explain the very docile behavior, until their eventual extinction.
Mm-hmm.
Now, ultimately, we don't know, and this study does not claim to provide any definitive answers on that question. Um, while we at least have Wera fossils in the Falklands that give us a minimum date of arrival at 1400 BC, which is certainly well within reason of the time that humans would have been in Tierra del Fuego, certainly by then. For now, like this mystery of the Wera must remain so. In that case, this combined evidence points to a human presence on the Falkland Islands going back almost 2,000 years by the Yamana people and their ancestors. But the authors make a crucial statement that there may not have ever been a sustained presence for very long.
Mm.
The Yamana may have only temporarily visited, or even ended up there accidentally, swept off course by ocean currents. Um, yeah, the latter to me does seem to make more sense, especially in light of the ethnographic material.
Mm.
So here's a paragraph by Elman R. Service in his 1971 book, Profiles of Ethnography, in the chapter where he summarizes data about the Yamana. And to read here, the Yaghan practically live in their canoes. They even install a sod hearth amidships on which a fire is kept continuously burning. Yet, important as the canoes are to them, and tempestuous as the sea typically is, the Indians do not construct a very seaworthy craft. It is merely a shell of sawn beech bark, more brittle than the birch bark of North America, over ribs of split saplings. The canoe is crescent shaped, about 15 feet long, leaky and unsteady. Outriggers are not known, but a sealskin is sometimes used as a crude sail if the wind is favorable. The wife paddles the canoe, while the man stays in with the bow and arrow to spear the fish, which are frequently sighted from his vantage point. Landing from the bark canoe presents a problem, for the gravel or stone beaches would quickly destroy the fragile bark bottom if the canoe were beached. The canoe is headed toward the shore, and the bowman and any other passengers step out before it touches. The wife then takes the canoe out to the edge of the heavy kelp beds in deeper water, where she moors it. She then swims ashore when the craft is to be used again. The wife is responsible for going out to get it. It is said that although the women are excellent swimmers, few men can swim. One can imagine that they might not be eager to learn. So, just based on this alone, and of course, this is barring any possible cultural changes that may have occurred in the past that were subsequently lost, like the Yamana, being a particularly seaworthy people, which is a thing that happens.
Yeah.
I mean, the famous example is the Tasmanians, of course. They have clearly descended from Aboriginal populations in mainland Australia, but when they were discovered by Europeans for the first time, they had lacked a lot of the tools and other technologies that people on the mainland had. But yeah, I don't think the image of a seafaring Yamana with the evidence at hand, paddling their canoes all the way to the Falklands on purpose is really all that accurate.
Mm.
These were probably likely more accidental trips. But of course, we could always be wrong, and that's what makes studies like this so important
Mm-hmm.
and certainly very exciting. So that's what I have to say on this. Albert, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Oh, I think that is so interesting. I mean, not just the evidence for the indigenous presence on the Falklands, even if accidental or temporary, um, but also the potential implications for the Wera, which, as you mentioned, has been a long-standing biogeographic puzzle. So no, I think this is a really amazing study, and I look forward to see what other revelations come up related to the subject. And I guess a sort of a funny anecdote related to this is, yeah, you mentioned that I brought up the Austin et al. Study to you, and the reason I remember that was because I remember talking about it on Incidents and Reflections. And for those of you who don't know, Incidents and Reflections um, was a radio show I did when I was an undergraduate student. And for part of that show's run, Joan was a co-host with me on that show. Now, we didn't attend the same university, so we were actually like calling each other over Skype while we were doing that radio show. So in essence, it's basically a precursor to Through Time and Clays, and we actually kind of mentioned that in our very, very, very first episode on this channel. So if you want to hear more about it, you can head back to that one. But in any case, I remember talking about the story on that show. However, when I actually went back to the archives to try and find where I talked about it, I realized that the study actually came out before Incidents and Reflections was even started. So either I misremembered, I didn't actually talk about it on the show, or I mentioned it but didn't make it the focus of like an actual news story within the episode, and so I didn't have an actual segment about it. Maybe just alluded to it. It is possible that I remember talking about it to my friend Alex, who was my first co-host on the show, and in fact, he was the one who came up with the show in the first place and invited me on to do it, um, because we would have been attending same classes at the time when the paper did come out in early 2013. So it's possible that I was talking with him about it and then thought I was talking with him about it on the show. But either way, without actually going back and listening to the episodes, I don't know for sure. But in any case, I remember thinking that that study at the time proposed a pretty elegant idea, because it did at least explain why the Wera made it onto the Falklands, but not like smaller mammals, because smaller mammals wouldn't have had as much of an easy time crossing such a long stretch of ice. But it is true that none of the other larger South American mammals made it either. So it's like you said, it does have some kind of areas that would require further explanation. And kind of this new study kind of bringing back the idea that it might have been humans who brought the were over. Yeah, that's just really fascinating. It's definitely a highlight of last month. I would agree.
Yeah, and I mean, it definitely is like one of those mysteries that has so many caveats to it
Right.
because, like, as you've heard from Darwin's descriptions, these dogs were super friendly.
That's right.
They'd come up to people, they'd take their food, they weren't afraid. Um, Normally, when you read about island animals like this, like that's usually explained as just a side effect of being isolated on an island for so
Right.
long with no natural predators. I mean, look at the Galapagos, for example. I mean, you people have to actually go there to make sure people don't harass the animals or pet them too much
Hmm.
because even after all this time they're still like relatively chill with people. Like you could be sitting on the beach and a hawk or a marine iguana will just sit next to you and be like, what's up?
Hmm.
And whereas if I try to do that in Florida, they run away or yell at you.
Yeah. Right.
um, so like it would make sense in that case. Like, okay, these dogs were here for a long time. They crossed over somehow, and then they just got used to like not having to deal with bigger things with teeth.
Right.
Um, uh, but then it's like there's also like other questions too, like like how are these things surviving? Like are they gonna rely on scavenging things from the beach for thousands and thousands of years? Like is that actually like a reasonable way of life for an animal? Um, and so like there's all sorts of like weirdness about it all. And of course, clearly these animals did survive for a long time. Um, but with this in mind, like that people may have brought them to the island, like these things begin to make a little bit more sense. That at least for a good period of time, like they were being well fed and cared for, and
Hmm.
they managed to figure out like what's good to eat on the island. And then when people eventually left, somehow that's the other thing too. It's like what if people came here to the Falkland Islands, if the Yamana did come to the Falkland Islands, and being known as they were in the ethnographic literature, at least, that these were not a seafaring people, and that they might have accidentally gotten blown off course here. Did they just live out the rest of their lives on the island until there was
Right.
no one left? Like that's a very dismal image.
Yeah.
Um, did anybody know that they were gone? Did they try come looking for them and then they got lost too? Um,
Right.
it's like one question is like 20 questions afterwards,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
um, but no, you're definitely right. Like this is a great mystery, and like a paper like this is definitely going to come a long way to helping us at least try to answer some of these questions. um, so yeah, definitely a big highlight. If you don't have anything else to add, we can move on to your first story.
Sounds good. So yeah, let's go on to the next slide, and we can get into that. So for this story, we're going to talk a little bit about fungi, and I may be wrong, but I think this is the first time we've done a story on fungi, or at least related to fungi. Um,
Woo!
yeah, so that's pretty cool. I guess fungi are one of those, at least as a multicellular life forms go, they're not a group that we think about that often. It's certainly compared to animals and plants. I think they often get the short end of the stick. Um, Now, of course, we are familiar with fungi, at least some of them. A lot of us eat mushrooms, I'm sure, and whether or not you like them is a different matter. I do personally tend to enjoy mushrooms. Um, However, fungi are very diverse, and so they come in all kinds of like shapes and forms and ecologies, and the edible forms that we can get at our grocery stores. They're really just scratching the surface when it comes to fungus diversity, um, and fungi are quite interesting for a number of reasons. So even though because they don't really move around like animals do, I think a lot of people associate them with plants, but they're actually more closely related to us animals than they are to plants. So yeah, fun bit of trivia for you. And in fact, in some ways, they in terms of how they live, they are more like animals. So unlike plants, they are not photosynthetic, so they do not make their own energy from sunlight. Instead, they have to quote unquote feed on other things, and the way they do this is they usually absorb nutrients from their surroundings. So they'll grow someplace where there's things that they like to eat, quote unquote. A lot of them like feed on dead and decaying material, and in doing so, fungi actually play lots of very important roles in the ecosystem. So, of course, the decomposing aspect I just mentioned, but the particular types of fungi that I'm mentioning in this story, they are part of a kind of ecological guild that are known as mycorrhizal fungi. And mycorrhizal fungi are those that have a symbiotic relationship with various kinds of plants. And so, what happens is that these fungi will grow on the roots of these plants, and then in doing so, they help the plants extract nutrients or water from the soil by kind of extending the surface area that those roots can reach. So they're kind of like making themselves like extensions of the roots and like kind of growing into the plants and being able to pass nutrients between themselves and the plants. And in return, the plants, because the plants can do photosynthesis, they can make sugars by using sunlight and pass those on to the fungi growing on their roots. And so there's kind of a two-way kind of mutualism going on there. And not only that, but these mycorrhizal fungi often connect different individual plants through the soil, because as they grow, they will actually link up different plants by their roots. And this actually allows plants to transmit signals to other plants that are very far away from them just through this kind of fungal network. It's like plant internet almost, but made of fungi. And and so plants can actually, for example, if one plant is getting eaten by caterpillars, it might be able to send out like these distress signals, and which get passed on through these mycorrhizal fungi to all the other plants in the area, and then these other plants will start to produce perhaps defensive chemicals so that they don't get eaten by caterpillars as well. And so yeah, you can see like what a kind of game changer like these fungi are, because they influence all these kinds of ecological processes like the nutrient uptake and the kind of communication between plants, if you can call it that, and so on. So these mycorrhizal fungi play very important roles in a lot of ecosystems. Now, in terms of reproduction, fungi have all kinds of different ways of reproduction. However, probably one of the most common ways is through the use of spores. And in fact, the kind of the part of a fungus that we tend to be most familiar with, like the mushroom, is basically a fruiting body of some types of fungus that produces spores. And what tends to happen is in most fungi that produce spores like this, they send the spores out into the air, and hopefully the spores get picked up by the wind and spread around. If the spores land someplace that's suitable habitat for the fungi, they will sprout. They will begin sprouting and then eventually grow into kind of full-fledged fungal bodies. And sometimes it can happen really fast. Like in a matter of hours, spores can sprout into like recognizable fungal bodies. So that's pretty incredible. Now, in most cases, they rely on the wind to transport their spores, and this can be a little scattershot. Like if they do get picked up by the wind, the spores can travel a decent distance, but a lot of the other spores, they kind of go to waste. They just kind of are let loose, but they don't land very far from their parent, and yeah, they just don't get to disperse very far, which is not ideal because you don't want to be competing with your parent over the same resources. So yeah, you might be familiar with, for example, puffball mushrooms. You might find those growing occasionally in your garden or someplace. Those if if you're familiar with them, you probably know that if you poke them when they're ready to spread their spores, they easily just send a ton of spores just into the air and basically explode, and that's why they're called puffballs. However, those spores don't really get very far most of the time. They just kind of land in the vicinity of the original parent fungus. But in any case, the fungi that we're going to talk about in this study, they spread their spores around in a different way, and in some ways is perhaps a more reliable way to get your spores far distance away from you. And that is by relying on animals. So they kind of rely on animals in a similar way to how plants might rely on animals to disperse their seeds. So, of course, a lot of plants will grow like fruit that's good to eat, and then when animals eat those fruit, they will also, hopefully, from the plant's perspective, ingest some of the seeds with it, and then they can travel somewhere and then deposit those seeds after the seeds take a journey through their digestive tract. So these fungi work in a very similar manner, but instead with their spores. And so they grow these fruiting bodies called truffles. You might have heard of truffles underground. And these truffles, they tend to produce a distinctive kind of scent that attracts certain kinds of animals, and so these animals come along and dig them up, and when they eat the truffles, they go about their day afterward, and eventually travel somewhere, deposit what remains of the truffles, including the spores, inside somewhere else. Hopefully very far away from the parent fungus. And so that's how these particular types of fungi disperse. So yeah, that's the general background for that. And you might have heard that people tend to use dogs or pigs to look for truffles, and that's exactly because of this ecological basis. Because pigs are very good at detecting that kind of a scent. They, after all, their wild ancestors probably ate truffles in the wild, and so they're able to kind of locate the scent and dig up those truffles and eat them. Of course, if it's a human that's directing them, they don't want the truffles to get eaten. But that's the idea at least. And dogs, they don't tend to know this innately, but they can certainly be trained to do it. And so in the wild, these spore dispersal events tend to have most been documented in the continents of North America, Europe, and Australia. And most of these animals that have been documented transporting spores in this manner are mammals, such as wild boar, for example. And so this study was pretty significant because, first of all, they decided to study spore dispersal in Patagonia, which is very understudied in terms of like how the fungi there actually operate in their ecosystem. But also, they found evidence that the spores of these fungi, were being dispersed by birds, and not just occasionally, but very often. And so the authors of this study found evidence that two kinds of birds in particular, they actually found some other kinds of birds did this too, but in particular, two species seem to have been kind of the main species that do this, called the chewcow tapaculo and the black-throated whet-whet. And I believe both chewcow and whet-whet are like references to the calls of these birds, so in case you're wondering where those names come from. Both of these birds are members of a group called the Tapaculos. These are a group of South American birds. They're members of the Passeriform bird group, the so-called perching birds. I talked about perching birds in episode 15 of my Dinosaurs, the Second Chapter series, so you can go and check that out if you want to learn more about them. And I believe I actually did mention the Tapaculos briefly, though of course, since that episode was so long and the Passeriforms are so diverse, I couldn't go into a whole lot of detail about them. But yeah, tapaculos are basically these small small birds that are mostly, they're not super brightly colored. They tend to be relatively drab grays and browns. You can kind of see that in the illustration here. I think the name tapaculo, from what I've heard, is actually Spanish for like the one who covers his behind. And the reason for that apparently is because they like to like cock their tails upward to like flip it up on their backs, and you can kind of see that in the top bird in the image here. So yeah, apparently that's where the name comes from. And they're kind of little mousy looking birds. I've often seen them described that way. They run around on the ground. They kind of look for food by kind of scratching in the soil. They don't like to fly very much. I'd mostly fly very short distances if you alarm them. And they even nest in burrows in the ground, so they're basically like bird mice, and they're very, very difficult to observe because they're so shy. They like to hide in very dense vegetation. They're not brightly colored, very secretive. And even like quite recently, new species of tapaculos, species that are new to science, are still being described. So yeah, they're certainly quite a mysterious group of birds. And there's a lot we don't know about them, and this study certainly illustrates that pretty well because this study demonstrated for the first time that tapaculos are actually very important in dispersing the spores of truffles in the forests that they live in Patagonia, where these authors were doing their research. And the evidence that they found was basically, first of all, they found the spores in the droppings of these tapaculos. They collected droppings from these birds and looked at them under a microscope and also tried to sequence DNA from these droppings. And all lines of evidence basically point to the fact that yes, the tapaculos are eating truffles and the spores are being passed through their digestive tract and deposited in the droppings. And not only that, but it is quite likely that the spores are still viable. That is, they could still grow even after having gone through that journey. And so it is very likely that this is a mutualistic relationship where the birds are dispersing the spores of these truffles. Now, they were also able to make like behavioral observations, like actually see the birds eating truffles in the wild as well. So that certainly is a pretty surefire clue that something is going on there. So the birds, as I mentioned, they tend to like look for food by scratching around in the soil and the leaf litter, and so most of the time in the past when people have observed these particular species, they're mostly eating insects, and they certainly do a lot of that. But as it turns out, sometimes when they're scratching around, they also uncover truffles, and it seems that when they do, they will oftentimes eat those truffles too. And that's pretty interesting because eating fungi is not very well documented in birds for the most part. And so, yeah, this is also quite significant in that sense. And not only does this study like kind of give us a better idea of how this ecosystem functions, we have the birds dispersing the spores and kind of these mycorrhizal fungi kind of having a mutualistic relationship with the plants that they grow on, and then the fungi growing truffles become food for the birds, and so on in that circle of life. But also, it seems that the truffles might actually have specific adaptations to attract the birds, to encourage them to eat them, essentially. So the authors observed that a lot of these truffle species are colored or shaped like seeds or berries, which are commonly eaten by these birds. And so that might be something to encourage the birds to eat them. And furthermore, a lot of these truffles seem to be able to reflect ultraviolet light at quite bright intensities, which is quite interesting because birds can often see in ultraviolet, unlike us. And so it may be that the truffles look, a lot more catching to the eye to them compared to how we would view them. So yeah, it may be that this is a kind of mutualistic relationship that has kind of co-evolved over a long period of time. And so yeah, this is really cool. A lot of attention being given to several understudied species, and it really teaches us a lot more about how some of these ecosystems function. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's always fascinating how these mutualistic relationships just kind of like feed off of each other so
Yeah,
much that they almost become like feedback loops
right, right.
that just kind of keep the cycle going as long as possible. Um, that is really incredible, and yeah, no, I definitely. It's definitely always a good thing when understudied species are like just kind of uncovered a little bit more than they
Hmm.
usually are.
Yeah,
Um, it makes them feel. I mean, not only less mysterious, but also makes them feel more real.
yeah, yeah.
If that makes sense. It's like it's hard to picture an animal you don't know a whole lot about in
Right.
regards to like its behavior, lifestyles, that kind of thing. And so like I'm able to picture these birds actually going out, into the forests and dispersing these truffles.
Hmm.
Just wonderful stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely agree with you there.
Oh, good deal.
Alrighty. Well, I guess if you don't have anything else to add, we can go on to your next story.
Yeah, sure. All right. So my other news story concerns the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which is an area in northwestern China that has been home to various peoples for millennia and formed a key part of the Eurasian steppe. in which nomadic pastoralists from the Huns to the Mongols crossed the continent. It's split by a mountain range into two basins, the Zungarian and the Tarim in the north and south, respectively. And the people who had been buried here for up to 5,000 years are the focus of this paper by Fan Zhang and colleagues. So, beginning in the early 20th century, explorers from Sweden, Germany, and Hungary reported their discoveries of mummified bodies
Hmm.
found in the dry Tarim Basin, so well preserved, in their felt and woolen clothing that they still had their hair, which ranged from blonde to brunette. There's an individual of one represented here on this slide. Now, these have dated between 2100 BC and 200 AD, and these mummies have raised quite a number of eyebrows. I mean, just to kind of bring out the elephant in the room, the scientists who first studied these remains pointed out that they don't look like East Asians and were far more similar to what they called Caucasians,
Hmm.
um, which is a term with a really rough history that
Right.
I wish people would stop using. Um, but similarly, the remains of people from the Zungarian Basin, which are dated between 3000 BC and 200 BC, were also argued to have not been particularly related to the populations of China and nearby regions. Now, of course, given the cultural highway that is the Central Eurasian steppe, it's remained an open discourse about where these people came from and how did they get here. Well, previous genetic results on the Zungarian remains, along with comparisons of archaeological material, have pointed to their origin from among the Afanasievo culture of southern Siberia, who were Bronze Age Indo European speaking peoples derived ultimately from the Yamnaya culture north of the Black Sea. You may recall our discussions of the Indo European expansions in episode 12 of Humanity, a Prologue, which would ultimately link these people with the ancestors of the Tocharians, who were recorded in Chinese writings as early as 500 AD. The match between genetics, archaeology, and linguistics seemed fairly close for this group of people. As for the Tarim mummies, they too have been argued to have belonged to this demographic expansion, based on some initial DNA studies,
Hmm.
but things were more complicated and messy in their case. For example, there was other research that was using archaeology that pointed to an association with the peoples of the what's called the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, which is in present day Afghanistan. So they would have arrived in the Tarim Basin not from the west, but from the south. And still, there were other studies that complicated their genetic ancestry, arguing that the Tarim people constitute an admixed population from both the west and the east of Eurasia. So, long story short, there's really no consensus on who the Tarim Basin people actually were,
Hmm.
what their story was. So, Zhang et al. Decided to clarify things. They examined ancient genome samples from five Zungarian individuals who were dated between 3000 and 2800 BC, and 13 Tarim individuals dated between 2100 and 1700 BC, as well as the dental calculus from the teeth of seven Tarim mummies. And so they compared these with the genomes of multiple peoples from Europe to East Asia to the Americas, past and present. That way, the sample size was very strong. Of course, the principal component analysis is shown here at the left. And if you can make it out, um, the Tarim mummies are centered in the kind of tannish brown and orange circles there in the middle of the chart.
Hmm.
And the Zungarian individuals are represented by aqua, bright purple,
Hmm.
and sort of like a blue jeans blue squares that are at the left of them and kind of across the middle here,
Hmm.
so you can kind of see where they plot. Now, concerning the Zungarian people first, the authors basically added confirmation of their link with the Indo-European speaking Afanastivo culture. They ultimately derive 50 to 70% of their ancestry from them, while the rest is more localized ancestry from the early Bronze Age of Lake Baikal, who are considered ancient Northeast Asians, and so thus they're related to the Tungusic speakers of Siberia, the so-called Neo-Siberians, which we've also talked about
Mm.
before on the show. This fits well with the archaeological understanding that Afanasevo peoples entered the Zungarian basin and set up shop, and then admixed with the locals. But it must be stressed, however, that there also appears to have been a genetic and cultural link between the Zungarians and the Tarim people, which will be important for this next point. The Tarim mummy genomes, by contrast, show no evidence of their ancestry ultimately arriving in the region from Indo European speakers or Bactria margiana peoples. Instead, 72% of their ancestry is autochthonous, so aka it's existed in the same region for a very, very long time.
Mm.
While the remaining 28% is that ancient Northeast Asian ancestry, also in the general vicinity. And here's where things get really interesting. The source of that 72% ancestry in the population was found to have been established over 9,100 years ago by
Huh.
ancient North Eurasians.
Hmm.
Now, you may recall from episode 9 of Humanity, a Prologue, that the ancient North Eurasians were a very old human lineage. They leave their traces in the archaeological record in the form of the Malta-Bure cultures of eastern Siberia between 21 and 15,000 years ago, as well as being the people who likely gave us the domestic dog. Their ancestry would contribute to both the Yamnaya culture of the Indo-European speakers, as well as the ancestors of the Amerindians, when they met up in the northeast of Siberia and admixed with the more East Asian populations there. But this enormous signature in such a relatively recently living people, because remember, the Tarim Basin mummies are between 2100 BC and 200 AD. That was a major surprise. Um, that this ancestry was just more or less still there after all this time, which is curious because the ancient North Eurasians, it was generally thought that once they had admixed with those east and west populations respectively,
Mm.
they kind of gotten admixed out of existence,
Right.
to kind of put it very, very loosely. I mean, they still survive in people today, but like as a culture and as a people, as a demographic, like
Mm.
that was it for them. Kind of like what's been argued for the Neanderthals,
Mm.
thousands of years early. And so, yeah, the so-called European features on these mummies then do make at least a little bit more sense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you look way into the genetic data, the ancient North Eurasian lineage has been found to have actually shared a common ancestor with the Western Eurasian lineage at about 39,000 years ago. And of course, the Western Eurasians were the foragers who initially populated Europe and gave us the Aurignacian cultures, among others. Which would, of course, mean that certain phenotypic traits would be shared to some extent thanks to genetic drift, which is a thing that happens. Now, the presence of these shared cultural traits between these Ungarian and the Taran peoples, again, that we had mentioned before, as well as the small traces of some genetic ancestry, well, that seems to clarify some of the past confusion of trying to figure out who these Taran Basin people actually are,
Mm.
or actually were. It is extremely likely that aspects of the Afanasyevo culture, including the Tocharian language, were passed down to the Taran people by these Ungarians. And indeed, the dental calculus evidence showed that the Taran people were also consuming grains and dairy products that these Ungarians were eating too. Of course, although the Taran people did not develop lactase persistence like their northern neighbors, which
Mm.
is kind of an interesting touch. Um, this cultural sharing wasn't just between them. And it seems clear that the data suggesting the links to the Bactria margiana peoples I had mentioned earlier, can still be found as evidence of some long distance trade. For example, we know that Tarim Basin people were using ephedra plants in their burials, which ultimately derived from the region of Afghanistan. So yeah, more work will need to be done, of course, to kind of find out just what happened in the history of these peoples and what was their eventual fate.
Mm.
Um, because they kind of drop out of Chinese records towards the end of the medieval era,
Mm.
and it's generally believed that they'd become absorbed in the overall Uyghur population, who are uh, Islamic Turks, if I remember correctly. But then there's also many other questions. Do the later Tarim mummies, which were not examined in this study, I mean, do they show evidence of admixture as they stayed in the region more and more? With these so-called Zungarian people. Is there a concrete link between the people described in the medieval Chinese records in the first place and these Ungarian and Taran peoples? Maybe we're projecting onto these records. Maybe this is another group of pastoralists that is kind of lost to history
Mhm.
in that sense. Yeah, these are all good questions, and for now, this study is much like the Falkland Islands one before. It's an extraordinarily good starting point
Mhm.
to kind of answer these inquiries. Um, yeah, what do you think, Albert?
Hmm. Yeah. So I actually wasn't all that familiar with this particular subject, um, but I think it's absolutely fascinating that we're getting such a detailed look at the kind of historical demography of these peoples, and uh, that we can find such surprising results. I think it's great that we're getting this look at them, and I'm sure that further research will elucidate more as well. As you mentioned, there are other mummies that have not yet been examined in this manner, so I look forward to seeing the results from those.
Yeah, like that's definitely really been the big concern that some people have had, like when the study came out, because they only examined like the older mummies. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like, yeah, like it's just a little chunk of time that we should probably look at more. Because I mean, I would not be surprised if in sort of the later mummies, as people had stayed longer and longer in the region, because it was really about that time that people were really starting to like move back and forth
Right.
along the Eurasian steppe. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point some Huns or Mongols or even Zungarians hung out with the Taran people and
Mm-hmm.
started families or what have you. Maybe we'll see those signatures there.
Yeah.
And of course, figure out like is what eventually happened to them. Like
Right.
is there any Uyghur ancestry there that might suggest when that merging may have started if that was the case. So yeah, definitely really fascinating stuff. Um, it kind of also kind of reveals, you know, I guess what something that's not really appreciated by a lot of people when
Mm-hmm.
they read about prehistory is that we tend to think about human diversity in terms of like racial models that
Right.
have been so prevalent for so long that we can paint these broad brush strokes like saying, oh, China, what kind of people live in China? Oh,
Mm-hmm.
they look like this, right? When in actual fact, if you actually look at the demographic history, even in recent times, much less in the past, I mean, there is so much diversity there
Mm-hmm.
that you can't paint these broad brush strokes in regions of the world. You can't draw these lines on a map and say, okay, the Chinese are here, and then here are like Mongolians, for
Mm-hmm.
example, or what have you. Everyone's always moving around, and everyone is always interested in hooking up with other people. I
Right.
mean, that seems to be one of the funny lessons of human history that we love to move around and we love to screw.
Right.
And that means that, I mean, as you can tell by this PCA chart here, which these are commonly used in these sorts of genetic studies, like you can't draw lines because they're so continuous with each
Mm-hmm.
other.
Yeah.
You can't say like, okay, European ancestry is here and East Asian ancestry is here. Like, no, like it for as long as we can record, people have been moving back and forth between these regions of the world, and it shows up in their ancestry, and it goes to show like these categories that people have created, 500 years plus ago, they don't accurately map human
Mm-hmm.
ancestry, and that's a really big point that I think people have been trying to make, and it's often ignored when we say like why race is not a biological reality. It's
Right.
just an impression on recent human minds to try to map out differences that they see that in under the skin
Yeah.
are very very subtle to non-existent.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely a fascinating thing there, and that's why I always appreciate studies like this that just kind of map out our history in this way and show how similar we all are really,
Yeah. Definitely.
um, even with all of our differences there,
Mm-hmm.
cultural or otherwise. But yeah, that's all I have to say on this. If you have anything else you'd like to add, we can move on to our final story.
Sounds good. Let's go on to the next slide then. Um, and I will have to provide a full disclosure here. My supervisor, Daniel Field, is a co author on this study, and in fact, it builds upon a previous study that he did with also with other co authors. And so, kind of the background to the study is that this study looks at the survival of mammals across the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, the end-Cretaceous extinction. So, the really famous one that wiped out most of the dinosaurs other than crown group birds. Um, and in a previous study, my supervisor and his co-authors found that they were focusing on the survivorship of birds during this event, and they found evidence that the birds that survived the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction were likely primarily ground-dwelling birds, not tree-dwelling ones. And that doesn't mean that these birds couldn't fly. I saw some news articles get this wrong. They're like, oh, these were flightless birds. No, not necessarily. These birds probably could fly, but birds that primarily probably spend most of their time feeding on the ground. So think things like chickens and quail and their relatives. They are able to fly, but they're mostly feeding on the ground, and they might fly up into the trees to sleep, but they don't. They most of the time they don't nest in the trees either. They also tend to nest on the ground, so they're not really like completely dependent on trees for their survival. And so, my supervisor and his co-authors propose that probably the birds that managed to survive the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction were kind of living in some similar way to that, and were able to survive in part because of this type of ecology. And the reasoning behind that is that during the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, probably one of the main kind of killing agents of this was the mass destruction of the forests at the time. Because what probably happened was that when that asteroid hit the Earth, it sent a ton of debris into the atmosphere. And as the kind of debris rained back down onto the ground, they heated up in the atmosphere and set fire to like all the green vegetation that it landed on, and of course that would have wiped out a lot of the forests. And in turn, if any animals weren't already killed off by the fires themselves, they would have found themselves in a kind of empty, treeless world, where the animals that depended on trees for survival would have had an extremely hard time and had less of a chance to survive than the ones that didn't. And indeed, we do know of, at the time of the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, like at the very end of the Cretaceous, there was a different group of dinosaurs called the Enantiornithians. They're sometimes called the quote-unquote opposite birds, which were very similar in many ways to modern birds. They were small. They could fly. They could probably fly pretty well, and probably were doing a lot of similar things that we see birds today doing, but none of them, as far as we know, survived the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction. And perhaps one of the reasons for this is that it seems that most of them at the time were specialized for living in, well, arboreal environments. So they were specialized for living in trees or feeding in trees. And so perhaps one of the reasons they died out was that the trees got wiped out, and so they couldn't survive in those conditions. Whereas the ancestors of the birds that did survive, modern birds, it seems that ancestrally, even though there are a lot of tree-dwelling birds alive today, most of their ancestors that lived during the time of the Great Extinction were probably ground-dwelling birds, similar to the chickens and quail, like I mentioned earlier. And they were able to hold on because they weren't completely dependent on trees for survival. And it was only after the extinction, when the forests started to recover, that modern type birds began to expand into the kind of arboreal niches that a lot of them now live in today. And I kind of talked quite a fair bit about this in my series Dinosaurs, the second chapter, so you can hear more about it there. But in any case, in this study, the authors, including my supervisor, wanted to find out if this pattern held true for mammals as well, because of course mammals are another famous group that kind of really diversified in the wake of the Great Cretaceous Paleogene extinction kind of probably benefited from the extinction of a lot of the larger animals that were around at the time, namely the non-bird dinosaurs. And so they wanted to find out whether the mammals that did survive were less dependent on trees than the ones that didn't, basically. So what they did was they did this in a very similar way to their bird study. So what they did was that they took a recently published, or rather a couple of recently published phylogenies of modern living mammals, basically the evolutionary relationships between all of these living mammals, and then they based on whether each kind of mammal was tree dwelling or non-tree dwelling or kind of mix of both. They kind of entered all this information into their analysis, and then used this information to try and estimate whether each common ancestor shared between each species of mammal was tree dwelling or not, and tracing that far back to the common ancestor of all living mammals, and especially to the ancestors that were alive during the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction. And I should add that even though mammals are famous for having diversified greatly after the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, not all mammals survived the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction. Not all mammals that were alive at the time survived. So mammals actually did take a pretty big hit as well, just like most of the other life forms that were around at the time. It was just some of the lineages that did survive that gave rise to the great diversity that we see today. And so after doing this kind of what we call ancestral state reconstruction, they were able to get a result. But just to kind of direct you to the figure on the screen here, I know it's probably very hard to read. It's because there are a lot of different species included in this tree. If you want, the paper is open access, so you can go see a bigger version of the figure in the paper itself, which will, as always, be linked in the description. But in any case, the branch tips that are in brown are non-tree dwelling mammals, and that does not necessarily mean ground dwelling in this context. For example, a lot of the bats in this tree are considered non-tree dwelling mammals because when they're not flying around, they're roosting in caves and not in trees. Now, of course, there are bats that do roost in trees, and so they are considered arboreal mammals. The arboreal mammals are marked in green, and it's worth mentioning that they use a pretty strict kind of definition for arboreal in this study. So they only considered mammals that are basically dependent on trees for survival to be arboreal. So basically they have to live in trees, or else they can't survive or it's very difficult for them to survive. So say something like a sloth, for example, would be considered a truly arboreal mammal in this context. But there are plenty of mammals that do climb trees a lot or use trees a lot and may rest in trees, but they're kind of, they can kind of take it or leave it, right? They're not completely dependent on trees for survival. If they don't have trees around, they could perhaps find a rock crevice or a cave or something to live in, and they would be just fine. And so animals like raccoons, for example. Raccoons are very good climbers, spend a lot of time in trees if they're available, but they're not obligate tree dwellers. They don't have to live in trees. And so those mammals are marked in gray in the phylogeny here. So those are considered semi-arboreal mammals. So they'll often use trees, but they don't have to. And so doing this, they decide to estimate kind of back in time which mammal ancestors were arboreal and whether this was the case during the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction. And what they found was perhaps surprising. And what they found was that in the groups, the lineages that did pass through the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary, which is marked in the red circle here. The red circle represents the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary, and the center of the circle represents the distant past, basically. So if you get closer to the center of the circle, you're going further back in time. So the groups that probably passed through the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary, most of them were indeed terrestrial mammals, or at least non-arboreal mammals. And so it does seem that the pattern also holds for mammals, that most of the mammals that survived the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction were not dependent on trees. However, this pattern was not as clear as it was in the bird study. In the bird study, it was very obvious that all the lineages that passed through were terrestrial lineages, and all the tree-dwelling lineages kind of emerged afterward. Whereas here, they found that there were at least two groups of mammals that might have already been arboreal at the time of the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction. And so one of these groups were the marsupials, so the pouched mammals that today includes things like opossums and koalas and kangaroos. And this has been inferred in previous studies that they might have been ancestrally tree-dwelling. Certainly, things like opossums are very arboreal. Many of them are, at least. And the second group of mammals that might have been around in the Cretaceous Paleogene that might have been ancestrally arboreal were the archontines, or recently more commonly called the euarchontines, but kind of the traditional name is archontines. So this group includes two groups from Southeast Asia called the tree fruit and the colugos, and they also include the primates, so our group. And so if archontines had evolved by the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary, then it seems that they were probably already arboreal back then. And so there might have been at least two of these groups of arboreal mammals that survived the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary. And the author suggests that maybe these groups were behaviorally flexible enough to make do for a period of time without like extensive forests being available, which means that basically they were adaptable enough that even though they were arboreal species, they might have been able to survive nonetheless by taking advantage of perhaps whatever resources happened to be available to them at the time. And certainly, primates today are quite resourceful animals, as we are quite familiar with. So it's not implausible that could have been the case. And so, yeah, I would say I definitely found it pretty surprising that they found the signal of terrestriality being kind of dominant for surviving mammal lineages, because definitely when I think of bird phylogeny, I can easily believe that yes, the ancestral crown bird was like a terrestrial animal, whereas with mammals, it seems that climbing behavior is so widespread in mammals that I would have expected, ancestrally, most of the modern mammal groups might have been to some extent reasonably capable climbers, and perhaps spending quite a lot of time in trees. But like they mentioned, in this context, they're considering arboreal mammals to be those that are completely dependent on trees. And in that sense, yeah, I guess it's not so far-fetched that perhaps the ones that did survive were the ones that were not so specialized for such a lifestyle for the most part. Now, there are some caveats to this study. So first of all, as I've kind of mentioned quite a few times on Dinosaurs, the second chapter, there's quite a large dispute about the kind of timing of divergences. Now, I mostly mentioned it in Dinosaurs, the second chapter with regards to modern birds, but it's also the case for modern mammals as well, that the timing of exactly when a lot of these lineages arose is not clear. And there's a lot of controversy over it, especially within the placental mammals. And I also mentioned this, I think, during the updates special for Humanity, a Prologue as well, because we were talking about Purgatorius, which is considered a possible stem primate that might have lived like right around at the end or shortly after the end of the Cretaceous. And you can see that in the kind of the phylogeny here. You can see that, just before the KPG boundary, do you see how close all of these different lineages are? Like how close, how tightly packed they are to each other in terms of when they diverged. And so, as you can see, it doesn't take much to kind of shift a lot of these divergences to after the KPG instead, right? And a lot of whether or not you actually find them before or after the KPG depends on the assumptions you make when you do these divergence time estimates. And so there is a possibility that some of these lineages that are shown crossing the KPG here might have originated afterward, including kind of the crown archontin node, and maybe most of the marsupial nodes as well. And so it's like maybe some of the lineages that they're inferring to have already been arboreal at the KBG might have also originated afterward. They just originate very early after the Cretaceous, and quickly expanded into arboreal niches. So there's a bit of uncertainty there. But I think regardless of the uncertainty in the divergence time estimates, I think the pattern would still hold. Like even if you shifted all these nodes kind of into the Paleogene, like past the KPG. Um, and there is a quite an interesting pattern in terms of like the acquisition of arboreality in different mammal groups too. Like they mentioned that we have these two groups that might have already been arboreal when the extinction happened, and then shortly after the extinction, it seems that we get the arboreal xenarthrans. So xenarthrans are the anteaters, sloths, and armadillos, and so it seems that kind of we get the xenarthrans entering arboreal niches very early in the Cenozoic as well. But then pretty much all the other arboreal mammal groups are relative arboreal latecomers, like a lot of the arboreal rodent groups, like the tree squirrels and the dormice, a lot of the arboreal bat groups and the arboreal carnivoran groups, they seem to have originated later during the Cenozoic. So yeah, we see these kind of two different phases of arboreal kind of ecologies coming into play during recent mammal evolution. And so it may be indeed that because the archontans and the marsupials and maybe the xenarthrans too, their ancestors might have already been somewhat a little more adapted to climbing than your typical mammal was. And then so very early on they already acquired these arboreal traits, whereas it took a bit more time for many of the other mammal groups to get into that niche. And now a second caveat I do want to mention here is that this study is pretty much based entirely on living mammals, and I think that's actually a pretty it's not an insignificant issue, I would say, because of course if you want to know what actually was going on, the only direct evidence we have are fossils. And now they do make the point in the paper that fossils of mammals from the very end of the Cretaceous and just after the Cretaceous are for most part pretty fragmentary. We do have mammal fossils, but most of them are known for like tiny bits of bone, like teeth, jaws, things like that. Like not enough to really tell us whether most of these things were arboreal or not. And so they kind of justify their approach based on that. They say, well, the fossils currently can't tell us enough information anyway. So just for now, we're basing this on the living groups. And, in the future, maybe fossils will prove us wrong or not. And they do give examples of how, yeah, we do know in some cases late Cretaceous mammals, a lot of these that are closely related to the modern surviving groups do seem to have been terrestrial species. So that does seem consistent with the model. But yeah, I do have to wonder if we're missing some patterns here because of leaving out the fossils. For example, there is a group of mammals called the multituberculates. They were very successful during the Cretaceous, and in fact, they survived the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, and they only died out later on in the Cenozoic, so they're not around anymore. But for some time, they were quite a diverse and successful group, and there definitely were arboreal multituberculates early in the Cenozoic, and I think probably potentially during the Cretaceous as well. So it's like, did the multituberculates that survived, were they also non-arboreal as well? I'm not sure. I don't know if we can be sure about that. So it would be interesting if we could get some good data on like the very end Cretaceous multituberculates to see whether they fit the pattern as well. So yeah, definitely an interesting study. And again, I'm not just saying that because my supervisor is on it. Like, I think this would be interesting even if that weren't the case. But yeah, I do look forward to whether we can get a clearer picture directly from the fossils and see whether this pattern continues to hold under those conditions. Yeah, what do you think?
I thought this was an incredibly fascinating paper. The exceptions are really interesting to
Mm-hmm.
me. I mean, of course, the matters about our contents are particularly relevant to my interests.
Right, right.
Um, and yeah, I mean, I can certainly attest that behavioral flexibility, at least for them, is certainly a possibility if this model holds out. Um, I mean, many of the Plesiodapa forms that I've talked about before, they've been described variously as like rodent-like and opossum-like,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't necessarily match what you think of when you think of primate.
Mm,
So it seems very reasonable. Like if it just so happens that there were Plesiadapiforms, at the end of the Cretaceous, that they would have held on somehow. Um, but yeah, I definitely agree with you there. Like the bracketing of this tree with fossils would certainly, I think, certainly produce a different typology here, um, especially given the controversies surrounding the identification of many of these animals,
hmm.
the animal fossils at the end of the Cretaceous. Like
Right.
you mentioned, Purgatorius. Yeah, that's a notorious critter.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of folks take it as granted that, oh, this is the earliest Plesiadapiform, aka the earliest stem primate.
Right.
But as we talked about in the update special, that's not consensus. In fact, it's been argued that, based on some studies, like they're not even like placental mammals
Right.
proper. Like they're
Right.
stem eutherians, which would take them way out of there. I mean,
Right.
maybe no more closely related to primates than whales are.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, it's just fascinating to look at. And yeah, I was gonna ask about the Xenarthrans too. That kind of had me curious there for a second. Like, like, wow, they um ancestrally arboreal. Like, it kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, but also, I'm also like not used to that line of thought because,
Right.
like, for pelosins, the anteaters and the sloths, like,
Right.
yeah, okay, that
Yeah.
makes
Yeah.
sense because
Yeah.
we have tamanduas and things. But then, like, the cingulates, the
Yeah. The
armadillos.
armadillos.
I've never seen an armadillo climb a tree.
Hmm.
Um, but given like the similarities with the pelosins, I mean, I suppose I can picture an ancestral armadillo being a tree dwelling animal of some sort, um, or at least like a flexible animal, like you
Hmm.
said, like a raccoon.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, armadillos are funny little
Oh
guys.
yeah.
But yeah, I think it is kind of fascinating. Like this takes me back to um, the brain and body size evolution papers we talked
That's right.
about.
Yeah.
How they did this for birds, and then they did it for mammals, and there were similarities there between the two,
Hmm.
and I mean, and notable differences as well.
Yep.
But like with like this sort of thing, like we're looking at going past the KPG boundary, like with birds versus mammals, and
Hmm.
how here, like the story is very similar between the two of them,
Yeah.
um, which kind of matches like what we're learning about like what had transpired at the end of the Cretaceous.
That's right.
This horrible event of fire and cooking.
Yeah.
Um, uh, it definitely makes you grateful for where you are today.
Yep.
That your ancestors survived not only that, but the Permian extinction and all the other
Right.
ones, and then some.
We are descended from survivors by definition.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Um, but this is cool. This is really fascinating, and yeah, I would definitely love to see this with more calibration from fossils,
Hmm.
to the best of our ability. Of course,
Right.
I definitely like better fossils too.
Yeah.
That we can say are like definitive Cretaceous placentals.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, we're making some headway with crown birds at least, so
Yeah.
maybe we're not too far from there.
Right.
Just have to wait and see.
Exactly. Exactly. But yeah, yeah, like yeah, you mentioned the kind of parallels between mammals and birds, and yeah, this is definitely another example of that. I remember hearing someone say like, it's almost as though the same thing happened to these two groups at around the same time. And well, yeah, that does seem to have been the case.
It makes me think about because like I know they've already done phylogenies on like frogs and
That's right.
lizards, and
Yep.
I wonder if those same signals and patterns are there if you were to do something like this for
Right.
those groups. Which I don't think anybody's done that yet.
Yeah, not too much. Not in this kind of detail. I think. I know there is some evidence. I think that in frogs, arboreality also kind of mostly originates after the KPG. I think in one of the big frog phylogeny that came out in the past few years, they mentioned that that most of the arboreal groups are like estimated to have originated afterward. So yeah, it may be that there's a signal there too. I'm definitely also very curious to look at these patterns, or at least have someone look at these patterns in other tetrapod groups as well, and not just the furry and fuzzy ones that we tend to think of. Um,
Right. Yeah. Well, hey, who knows? Maybe we'll do for that soon.
yeah,
And if that's the case, we'll certainly talk about it.
indeed, indeed. I'll be sure to keep tabs on that. That's for sure. Alrighty. Do you have anything else left to say, or should we get on to closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'm good to go.
Alrighty. If you enjoyed the show, please consider supporting us on Patreon. We have one of those now, and your contributions will help us continue our series and develop new projects. As we have been mentioning for the past few episodes, we are working on a website to kind of accompany the show. We're putting on like supporting information from our two series, Humanity: A Prologue and Dinosaurs: The Second Chapter. So hopefully in a accessible manner, and also in a more up to date manner than they are as they are recorded. So look forward to that. We're still in early stages still with the website. We are working on it, but it's a lot of work. There's a lot of writing, a lot of researching that we have to do on top of like all the other things that we're busy with, as we constantly mention. And so, yeah, it will take some time. It will probably take like several months at least before we are in a state to launch the website. But yeah, we are working on it, and we are looking forward to revealing it to everybody. And so if you want to support our work, Patreon is a good place to do so. We currently have 2 patrons in total, last I checked, which was earlier today, and one of them is Joan's sister Julie, who has who has added a patron tier that requires us to give her a shout out in every episode. So there you go. All right. And as always, we would like to thank our friends Henry Thomas for the music that he wrote for our show, the theme music, which is amazing, and also my friend Alicia for coming up with the color scheme of my avatar. So now it gets reused in whenever I need to color in my Alvarez avatar. Now, if you want to keep up to date with our episodes, you can follow us on Twitter. We tweet every time we release a new episode. And of course, you are probably listening or watching us on our YouTube page, YouTube channel. So if you haven't already and you enjoy our show, then please subscribe. You'll also be notified whenever we upload a new show there. And if you have questions, you may leave a comment. We do enjoy pretty much all the comments that we get. Or you can send them to our email at timeenclades@gmail.com if you don't feel like leaving a comment on YouTube, and I understand if you don't. As always, we will link to all the papers that we discussed in the references in the description below, so you can check them out there. And yeah, I think that's it. We currently do not have a set schedule for what or when we are gonna upload for our next episode, so I guess it'll be a surprise. So look forward to that. Of course, we will eventually come back to do a November news episode in the month of December. So at the very least, we'll definitely see you again then.
Yeah, and again, like just to reiterate, we definitely have a review of Dawn of Everything forthcoming. Um, Ideally, I would like to have it done this month, but I cannot make any promises on that front. So, yeah, as Albert said, it'll certainly be a surprise, and I think at the very least, I'll put a little announcement on our Twitter to just kind of let people know what's up. But yes, thank you so much for joining us, and yeah, take care.
Sounds good. Take care, everybody. Later.